Welcome to this inaugural public lecture. I'd like to take a few words to introduce our speaker. Stephen Howard is our senior academic research leader in child development and education. We are a department that's quite strong in child development and education, and we're delighted to have Stephen join our team. Stephen's work, as you'll quickly realize as he presents, has a very deep, thoughtful engagement with the complexities of child development, particularly cognitive development. He has a focus on developmental trajectories, concern about what are the precursors to attainments, to well-being, and a deep sense of how to measure outcomes. He has worked in production of some of the most difficult aspects of application of psychology into education. He's worked in the area of intervention development and in the area of assessment development. And in both, he has created what I would call products which are agenda shifting in terms of research. His engagement has been, of course, across the scholarly community, but he's also engaged with civil society, he's engaged with governments, he's engaged with philanthropies and industry. Given the world we are in, he has a running start, of course, in understanding child development in the here and now, but his research agenda has moved to the digital domain as well. So we might hear a bit of that in his presentation. He works across cultures. Some of his work has started appearing in other contextual settings. And as I was telling Stephen, one of the sort of most difficult litmus tests in things that we produce out of our research is, does it survive as it crosses boundaries, national boundaries, cultural boundaries, linguistic boundaries? And that's an interesting question, and maybe you'll address a bit. He does a lot of work, and here's just a few sort of snapshots of what he does from the titles of his most recent papers. He works in the area of engaging educators and co-design, works in the area of educator beliefs. He works about in the area of parental technology use. It's not education just in the context of schooling, but also beyond. Now, the work that Stephen does is around the area of attention, inattention, regulation, dysregulation. These kind of topic areas are not just important for psychology, cognition, education. I was talking to Stephen to ask him if he started conversations with philosophers, because these topic areas are deeply about being human and what is the human child and how does the human child capture these kinds of regulatory functions. So over to you, Stephen, for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment. And thank you all for coming as well. Because this is my inaugural public lecture, what I wanted to do was give an overview of my program of research into early childhood self-regulation and some of the different directions that's taken me. Not all of them, but I'll do my best to do justice to the core program of work. I tend to like to start with a little bit of my journey, and a seminar last week just cemented that it really gives you a sense of why does the person do the things that they do and how do they think about the things that they think. So I wanted to start with a brief, where did I come from and how did I get to studying the things that I study now? So I studied at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And the lab that I studied in was of a prominent neo-Piagetian, Juan Pascual Leone, and his partner, Janice Johnson. For those who don't know Juan's work, he has quite a comprehensive and deep and complex theory of cognitive development, but cognitive development in a way that underpins child development. So my start was really in the area of what one would call mental attentional capacity, but arguably that's one of the inspirations for what we think about in attention when we think about working memory and contemporary working memory theory now. So I started in, let's say, working memory, although one would roll over if he heard me say that. And then I moved in those studies towards executive functions more broadly. My PhD thesis was specifically on inhibitory control and whether there are separable dimensions of inhibitory control and how that articulates with attention and working memory. I then moved to Australia and started with the University of Wollongong. Wollongong's about an hour south of Sydney. Still doing the sort of executive function things that I did, I should say, at York University. My studies were in psychology, developmental and cognitive processes. At University of Wollongong, I was in a school of education, and I was tasked with bringing the sorts of things that I did into educational problems and contexts and solutions. And one of the things that I learned very quickly was constructs like self-regulation were very squarely at the forefront of educators' minds and conversations, families' minds and conversations as well, inbuilt into curricula, even more so than executive functions were. So just to say that a thread of self-regulation and a focus on self-regulation, this was one of the inspirations for that. About 10 years ago, University of Wollongong got something to the order of $35 million in funding to build this thing that they called Early Start. Early Start is a facility that is at the same time a public access children's play museum. This was my backyard for a while, and outside my window getting to hear children play and run around and also be upset, but all manner of different kinds of play and learning and development happening. It was also teaching and learning spaces and a partnership with 50 different early childhood education and care services, where they fed back the things that were priorities for them and on their mind. And we attempted to feed forward research and solutions that could come to bear to the things that they were concerned with. With that funding and infrastructure, I was asked the question whether I could do the things that I do younger than I had done them before. In my studies, I tended to focus from age 7 through to adulthood. And now I was asked if I could do the sorts of things that I did starting from maybe about age 3, or even better if I could look even younger than that. So about 10 years ago, that started a particular journey and focus into early childhood. And then more recently, as Shonali mentioned, in 2020, we secured funding from the Australian Research Council for a Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child, where we try and understand Australian digital childhoods, although broader than Australia. And for me, that led to a program of research that tries to understand if, where, when, how, for whom self-regulation has bearing on children's digital activities and behaviors, and some of the challenges that we frequently talk about and hear about surrounding digital engagement. And here I am. So towards the end of last year, I started with the Department of Education here at University of Oxford in December last year, and I'm very happy to be speaking with you all today. So I mentioned that the core of my research concerns early childhood self-regulation. And I just want to acknowledge upfront that there are a lot of very different views about what self-regulation is. When we ask parents and educators, they tend to tell us about things like challenging behaviors and emotions. We often see in those conversations that self-regulation gets tied up with compliance. Did they do what I asked, when I asked, in the way that I asked? In the sequence that I asked them to do it. Obviously, the answer is more nuanced and complicated than that. And I just want to bring that to life here. So this is a group of children that are performing one of our observational self-regulation observational assessment paradigms, which is memory card game, but wrapped around it is an observational framework and rating system. So the children are playing a memory card game. Pairs of cards are face down. You need to flip over 2, try and find a pair and get as many as you can. Except we don't care who gets what pairs. That's not what we're interested in. We're interested in self-regulation. We're interested in whether they're paying attention when we're explaining the game. Not just during their turn, but in other children's turns as well. Do they sustain their attention? Can they stay within the rules and structures of the game? And can they start to internalize those sequences? Do we have to constantly say, okay, it's your turn, you do this? Or do they start to learn that and be able to enact it themselves? And so those are the sorts of things that we're concerned with. And I want to tell you about the little gentleman on the left here, Kai. So Kai was lucky, unlucky, depends how you think about it, to be the first one to start the game. You don't know where any of the cards are when you're first, so you're randomly flipping 2 cards. And as you might expect, he did not find a pair when he flipped those 2 cards. But he kept watching. So the next child went, flipped 2 different cards, and he saw a pair. You could see in Kai's eyes that he knew where there was a pair, and he was waiting for it. The third child went, didn't know where the pair was, so flipped 2 cards. Kai's still anxiously waiting, but waiting. Miss Scarlett on the right was also paying keen attention and knew where that pair was, and immediately went for that pair. And Kai was frustrated, as you might be. And Kai's frustrated response was crossed his arms, and he turned his back to the game. And we were interested in more than just what was the frustration response. We wanted to understand the tail of that. We wanted to understand what sits around it. So even though we had an adult facilitator playing the game, Kai was still sat there. He was turned away. He was taking a minute. So we let him. And the game continued on. Scarlett took her next turn. About 20, 30 seconds later, what Kai did, without any prompting or intervention or support, is he turned himself back around. More than just turning himself back around, it was now his turn. And Kai had remembered where another pair was that he was waiting on. So even though he was looking away from the game, not paying attention to anything that was happening, still in his mind, he was holding on to where those pairs were that he had seen previously. And then he went and got that pair and carried on the rest of the game happily. That's the sort of nuance in self-regulation that I really want to try and disentangle. So what do we know about these complexities? What is self-regulation, and how does it grow? And what are the factors that influence its growth, and how can we support its growth in all of this messiness and complexity? There's a little bit less happy Kai. Now, maybe that sounds straightforward. I want to understand self-regulation, what it is, how it grows, the things that grow it, and the things that we can do to help grow it. But it's a lot less straightforward than that. In fact, there's a study by Jeremy Berman and colleagues from 2015 that reviewed the self-regulation literature, and this was a decade ago. I would venture that it's worse now, not necessarily better. What they found in reviewing the self-regulation literature is 447 unique terms used to characterize self-regulation. They were able to reduce that to 88 different related concepts of self-regulation. And if they got really broad, they could come up with 6 very broad conceptual clusters of what we mean by self-regulation. So just to say that there remains a lot of inconsistency and debate and challenge around even the question of what is self-regulation before we get to those other questions. Now, what do I mean by self-regulation when I'm talking about my program of research? I tend to adopt a conception of self-regulation that emphasizes our ability to exert effortful control over our attention, over our thinking, over our behaviors, over our emotional reactions, to deal with impulses or reactions or responses that are inconsistent with our goals or contextual requirements. And there's a number of good reasons for this particular conception of self-regulation and why I focus on this conception. One of the ways that I've written about this notion of self-regulation is it enables certain kinds of freedom for a young child. Freedom from impulses and maladaptive distractions, freedom from needing constant direction from others. But we also know from research that in the moment, a child adept at self-regulation is more likely to do a whole litany of things than a child lower in self-regulation, resist distractions and sustain their attention. When faced with challenge, they're more likely to redouble their efforts than throw in the towel. Endure temptations, delay gratification, wait their turn. They can start doing things that they might not want to do. It's time to brush your teeth. Or they can stop doing things that they might not want to stop. It's time to pack up playing and come for lunch or come for dinner. We also know that this conception of self-regulation is highly predictive of a broad range of later life outcomes. And I'm going to circle back to that one. But I wanted to also highlight that it's a leading concern for families. Now, previously, I would often cite Australian studies that would tell you it is parents' #1 concern in a national survey of, and all of that is true. But in the Parent Kind UK National Survey from 2025, they didn't explicitly ask about self-regulation. There weren't self-regulation items with that label per se. but they did ask about behaviors and emotions that are underpinned by self-regulatory abilities. In fact, when parents weren't prompted and were just asked open-ended, what are the things that make parenting challenging for you? Some of the things that they listed unprompted were children's behaviors and emotional challenges. We know that self-regulation is increasingly emphasized in curricula. Early as foundation stage, self-regulation is an early learning goal. It's a priority focus for educators around the world. Cases and reports of high levels of classroom disruptions and big feelings and big behaviors. It's really prominent in public discourse. I don't think a day goes by where I don't hear something self-regulatory about children's digital activity. I've heard techno tantrums. There are concerns about screen time. In Australia, we've recently enacted a social media ban that I understand is being contemplated here as well, and on and on and on. I don't think there's a day that goes by that I don't hear something in the media around that too. So I said I'd cycle back to predictive of broad later life outcomes. You may know this study, apologies if you've heard it before, but one of the studies that really piqued my interest around self-regulation was by Terry Moffat and colleagues in 2011. They used Dunedin study data where they had 1,000 children. And while they didn't measure self-regulation per se in that study, what they were able to do was they were able to identify items that they could compile together that look very much like contemporary self-regulation patterns. Parent report, teacher report, observer report, and the sorts of things that they were asking about when they cobbled them together look a lot like other self-regulation measures that you might intentionally use. To do that, they needed to pull items from across ages 3 to 8. So it's quite a large span of time that they're pulling data from. But even still, what they found was early childhood self-regulation between ages of 3 to 8 was predicting a huge array of outcomes 3 decades later. Your self-regulation in early childhood was predicting, from their title, health, wealth, and criminality into adulthood at age 32. And the list went on from there too. Substance dependence, whether you dropped out of school early, unplanned pregnancy, unemployment, credit problems. The list was long and compelling, and the associations were robust. Which can be a little bit scary if we sort of take that deterministically, that early childhood self-regulation is a really robust predictor of these later outcomes. Of course, longitudinally, they were able to look at children whose self-regulation changed over that period of time as well. Now, this wasn't an intervention study. They don't know why self-regulation changed for the better or worse over that time, but they could identify where it changed. And what they identified is any cause improvements in self-regulation across childhood was associated with better outcomes in almost all of the outcomes they evaluated later. And of course, there's a really robust literature on all sorts of other things that self-regulation has been implicated in terms of more immediate to very longer term outcomes. In fact, we find that too. So we analyzed a national data set from Australia, the longitudinal study of Australian children, which had more than 5,000 children. And one of the things that we were able to do, in contrast to what Terry Moffat was able to do, is we were able to narrow our self-regulation index to a narrow window of a single time point when children were aged 4 to 5 years of age. We also had self-regulation when they were 6 to 7 years of age. So we could also look at change over a pretty narrow window of time. But we found the same sorts of things. So +1 standard deviation in self-regulation problems at age 4 to 5, a decade later, was associated with 0.2 of a standard deviation lower reading and numeracy, more than 2 times increased risk of school truancy and self-harm, suicidal ideation and self-harm ideation, almost 2 times risk of smoking and property crime and violent crime, increased risk of mental health problems. Every single outcome that we associated, that we looked at, self-regulation in early childhood was associated with each of those outcomes a decade later. Where self-regulation problems increased from 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 years. So just over a course of 2 years, those odds ratios increased. The risk levels increased sometimes to threefold, a 3 times increased risk. We went a step further as well. We wanted to analyze everything that we know about self-regulation and its association with later outcomes. So we meta-analyzed that entire literature, self-regulation, either cross-sectionally or longitudinally, looking at what are the outcomes that it predicts. We looked at 25 different outcomes across those studies, 150 studies, almost 750 associations, more than 200,000 children, and self-regulation was associated with every single one of those outcomes. Now, here I've got a visual depiction of those correlations, and some of the patterns are as you might expect them to be. The cross-sectional associations are across the top, and those are bigger, those are stronger, conflated by point and time factors. But even when we look longitudinally, from preschool predicting outcomes in early childhood, or early childhood predicting outcomes into later childhood, or childhood predicting outcomes into adulthood, the associations that can exist almost uniformly do still exist, even though they become mitigated to an extent. So it seems a really robust finding that something about self-regulation is underpinning learning development trajectories that have arms into all of these different realms of development and human function. But there's an intellectual problem, and I foreshadowed this at the very beginning with Jeremy Berman's work and the number of different concepts. There's really low agreement on what self-regulation is and what the boundary conditions are, what it is, but also what it isn't, how it functions, how it develops, how do we assess it, and what are the means by which we stimulate self-regulation growth. And I want to give just some examples of where this diversity exists. So for some, self-regulation is a capacity. It's a relatively stable thing. It's a developing capacity, but relatively stable individual differences in self-regulation. And we see that in things like a marshmallow task, the very prototypical, if you can wait 5 minutes, 8 minutes, or if you're particularly cruel, 10 minutes and not eat a marshmallow, then you'll get a second one. Those sorts. There are all sorts of other self-regulation paradigms that take this capacity focus now as well. I just put this one up as a prototypical. There are also accounts like Clancy Blair's model of allostatic load and self-regulation that talk about situational influences and the fluctuations in self-regulation over time. So to Clancy Blair, we have from the environment and our context and all sorts of different sources, this allostatic load, stresses or excitements or the things that are bringing us up or bringing us down. Within a manageable window, we can exert top-down control to keep that in a manageable range, and then we can remain being intentional and planful and goal-directed and all of those sorts of things. But when our stresses get too high, when our excitement gets too high, that it outpaces our top-down control, that's when we see dysregulation happen. And that's when we're more impulsive or we make more emotional decisions or all the sorts of things that are often characterized as dysregulation. According to this model, self-regulation is almost like a bit of a waveform across the day with peaks and troughs. And then there are other accounts that talk about self-regulation as contextually bound. If you wait for 2 marshmallows, does that mean you're going to go back into that nursery room and you're going to share nicely and you're not going to snatch the toy away from the other child? They might not necessarily transfer that way. If I can do well in that task, am I going to have a reasonable amount of screen time? I'm going to come back to screen time. But the two don't necessarily translate one to the other. Self-regulation is at the same time positioned as an ability, as a process. Clancy Blair's would be more of a process or an outcome model, a set of skills, or self-regulation is an outcome that we've achieved or we've not achieved. The reality is it's probably all of these things, but what we have is quite fragmented theorizing and not very clean ways to try and understand and integrate these different perspectives. So I wish what I could do next is say, so here is the answer and here is the model. Spoiler alert, I can't. But to say, this is some of the work that we're doing. And I just wanted to highlight some of it. So in 2024, we launched the Sprout study in Australia. This was funded by an ARC Future Fellowship grant, where we're following children across 3 years over the transition to school period. At time 1, they're 4 to 5 years of age. We actually let in some 3-year-olds, so 3 to 5 years of age. At time 2, because children need to start school before their 6th birthday in Australia, half of the children had gone to school. This was last year, and half of the children were still in early childhood education settings. By year 3, which will be this year, all children will be in school. So we've got those different time points of children's self-regulation over the transition to school period. Self-regulation is a core construct, but we have about 50 different potential antecedent variables. We have all sorts of outcomes that we've captured as well. But I think some of the things that I'm most excited about are the nested studies that we've built in. So we have that longitudinal core. We can link all of that data, but every year we have a smaller deep dive study that can help us try and disentangle some of these theoretical complexities I was talking about. One of them, for instance, and I'm glad to say I've already roped in some partners in crime in this room for this study and analysis, is fluctuations in self-regulation over a preschool day. So for this study, as a quick snapshot, we'll have multiple data captured to understand that waveform of self-regulation and the factors that lead to peaks and troughs and what the tails look like after. We'll have some passive physiological capture. We'll have observational ratings using established measures, the RSM, established measures of self-regulation at set intervals, wrapped around with an observation framework and checklist and ethnographic field notes, so that we can understand the context, the conditions, the antecedents, what children were asked to do, who they were doing it with, what were the expectations, what was the time of day, all of those things to understand the different waveforms that we see across a day and what the factors are that influence those waveforms. The other one for this year that I'm quite excited about was inspired by a presentation that I saw by an early childhood education and care organization back in Australia. And what they were looking at was what were the predictors of serious injury in early childhood education and care. And they were presented, they had a large data set on which children got seriously injured, those that needed medical attention outside of the center. And they had a whole range of predictors that they could look at. And the predictors that they reported on were things that I would have expected them to be. But what I've found most profound is almost none of them were the ways that I would have predicted them to predict serious injury. So where we often model things linearly, they found things like, rather than a linear association between age and injury, there was a point estimate at 3.5 years of age was a particular risk of injury. A point in time when children's will maybe outpaces their skill to an extent. They're trying more risky, ambitious things, but their skill level doesn't quite match what they want to be able to do. They found attendance patterns was a predictor. So a single day in time, rather than, again, a linear sort of association or a curvilinear one. You know the center less and educators know you less because you're there less frequently. And those sorts of factors. So what I found really compelling was the ways that I would have modeled those variables that I would have expected probably wouldn't have revealed what was actually going on in those data. So they had used machine learning approaches that we're going to apply to these data to try and look at those same sorts of questions, but related to self-regulation. And to go the one step further that they did too. So what they particularly wanted was not just to identify what were the predictors, but understand the cases that were off of that line of prediction. So where were the centers that had all sorts of risk factors, but children weren't getting seriously injured? And where were the centers where there were a lot of injuries, but none of those risk factors, and what was going on there? And that's what we'd like to do as well. Lots of risk factors, but high self-regulation, and do a deep dive into their life and their context and their circumstances to understand what our theories and our models are missing. That's the intellectual problem. I'm not done there. There's a practical problem too. Practical problem is that research establishes that there's a concerning minority of children that seem to make little to no progress in self-regulation across the preschool years. And it's not just that this resolves by the time they reach and are in school for a certain period of time. In fact, that 20% of children that show little to no progress in self-regulation by age 7 tend to be at mean levels that you would expect at age 4 in self-regulation. For these and all the research reasons that I cited before, there's been an explosion of interest in interventions related to self-regulation and related to executive function. We wanted to review some of this. Our particular interests are what are the real world, everyday, low cost, barrier free ways that we can try and affect these things so they're as widely accessible as possible. So we carved off to try and narrow the problem space. What are the interventions related to self-regulation or executive function that have been done in early childhood education and care settings just in the last 20 years? We found 85 different programs that were evaluated in early childhood education and care settings in the last 20 years, adopting 12 different approaches, everything from play in games, make-believe play or circle time games, red light, green light, or what's the time, Mr. Wolf, those sorts of things, mindfulness and yoga, to music, rhythm and movement and beat, exergaming, computerized brain training, arts-based approaches, really, really diverse sorts of ways to try and foster self-regulation and executive function. Unfortunately, I have to say that most showed small or null effects. 65% of all of the effects that were tested were small to non-significant, and almost none of them reported gains in sort of the real world outcomes, that is the promise from the studies like Terry Moffat's of self-regulatory change. So our practical problem is this: we have highly variable self-regulation trajectories, a few reliable ways to support its growth. But one of the silver linings of our review, and one of the things that I keep going back to it for again and again, is we were able to identify conditions that were associated with high efficacy in the program. And there were some commonalities, even though their approach was diverse, whether it was an arts-based program, a physical activity program, a play-based program, things like incremented cognitive challenge, group sizes that allowed for tailoring that cognitive challenge to the children's needs in that group. Autonomy support was a really big one that came out of work led by Natalie Day. In her work, she found that parents very frequently want to jump in quite early. A child's experiencing a challenge, I'm going to alleviate that challenge, which means that the child never gets to experience and encounter and surmount that challenge. So instead, she advocates for autonomy supportive practices. Training of the interventionist to fidelity. There seems to be something with integrated movement that comes through relatively consistently. Coaching and mentoring, child practice with feedback, contextual alignment to the change stop. The list goes on, dose and duration and all the things we might expect, but these were some of the headlines. So as Shonali mentioned, we've been involved in some intervention development as well. Not satisfied to just figure out what seems to matter, but I want to try and make it matter. My first foray into this, and this is more sort of proof of concept, or at least I hoped it was proof of concept rather than this is the way. And it was quite a fun one, if I say so myself. I got to develop a children's picture book with a children's book writer and illustrator here in the UK, Quincy Quokka's Quest. And what we did is it's a storybook like any other. Quincy lives upon a hill, and in fact, he'd be there still. But within that journey and within each page, there's an activity that the adult and the child engage in. This one, for example, is a prototypical Stroop-like reversal where the adult will point across the snakes and frogs. And whenever you point to a snake, you say ribbit. Whenever you point to a frog, you say hiss, and you need to inhibit the impulse to do the thing that you've overlearned to do. So quite a prototypical inhibition paradigm. Anyways, we wanted to see if we could incorporate these things into the sorts of things that families, educators, children are doing anyways, reading stories, and can we inject some executive function challenge there? And what we found is across 9 weeks of reading, 3 different studies, and one of them we were reading once a week, and others we were reading 2 or 3 times a week. But we saw improvements in inhibitory control and cognitive flexibility over that 9-week period. We found that whether we were reading one-on-one with the child or whether we were doing group readings with a group of children and they were taking turns coming up to do the activities over that period. So to me, that was a proof of concept. Can we identify things that are low cost and barrier free and minimal modifications to the things that we're already doing? It's not this big program that you need to learn and change up your whole life to be able to do. It's not difficult to scale because it requires me to go around or a team of people to go around. It's not very expensive to access. What are those minimal modifications that we can recommend to families and educators that could make a difference? So our next step was what we called the Persist program, which was funded by an ARC DECRA grant. And this was a broader program that comprised of educator practices, things like autonomy support and many others, like I was talking about before. 3 minimally modified child activities. There's also a formative observational assessment, and all of this was intended to be embedded in everyday practice. We wanted to identify the things that educators were already doing and just minimally modify those things so that we got this self-regulatory and executive function challenge. I'll give you just one example to bring it to life, so it's not so abstract. Musical statues. I'm sure everyone in this room has played musical statues. The music plays and you dance, hopefully better than I'm dancing right now. We're not recording, are we? Yes. And then when the music stops, you freeze. Right? And when we play this game with children, for the children that don't freeze, what do? You're out. You're out of the game. So the child that struggled the most with inhibitory controls, self-regulation, whatever you might want to call it, got the least practice in doing it. That doesn't make any sense at all. So can we take things like that and modify them so that's not the case? So those children actually do get that experience. So in our version of musical statues, you're not out of the game if you don't stop dancing. What you do first is you go down to your knees. We're taking your legs out of the equation. Now you're dancing with your upper body. If you still don't freeze, you're sitting on your bottom. We've taken more of your body out of it. If you do freeze at some point, you move back up a step. So the children are actually getting that opportunity to practice, and there's some feedback in how they're going to. That's one of the 30 different activities that we had built in. We ran a cluster RCT on that program with 50 different preschools. There were more than 100 educators involved and 473 children. We found significant improvements in executive function and non-significant, but all of our self-regulatory and academic outcomes that we were looking at were all descriptively pointed in the direction that we wanted, even if they didn't reach significance. There's been adaptations and evaluations of this program now in Italy and Greece. I think the one from Italy has been published and the one from Greece is under review. And some of the things that we did in the Persist program have informed some of the things that we've done with colleagues here at Gaia Sheriff, University of Oxford, with the ONE program, trying to integrate executive function within early mathematics learning. And take a bit of a sidestep. I didn't have a really great segue into this one, but it's an important part of the work, I think. And it's how do we assess the sorts of things that that enable this research? And I don't think I could do half of the things I do without some of this work. So when I was asked, can you do the things that you do younger than you've done them before? I started looking at every article I could find, firstly on executive function in early childhood. And I feel like I tried every single assessment that I could find. In most cases, when I would watch children do those assessments, I just didn't feel confident that what their performance was a good reflection of what they could do. I'll give just one example. So we identified a go, no go with fish and shark that you do on a laptop computer. For those who don't know what a go, no go is, you put this laptop computer in front of a child, there's a cartoon fish on the screen, and whenever you see a fish, you press the space bar. Put a bright, colorful sticker on it so it's easy to find the space bar, and you push whenever there's a fish. Every so often, a shark will appear on the screen. You don't want to catch the sharks, they'll nibble your fingers or something like that, so you don't push anything when it's the sharks. But because there's so many fish, and they're so fast, and they're so repetitive, you get in the habit of pressing that space bar. So it's really hard to stop whenever a shark comes. Even adults, you can see them start to go and pull their hand back at the last second. Young children, when we did this exact paradigm, you would see, they see a fish on the screen, their face lights up, they're ready to make a decision, and then they go looking for the key. and then they push the key. And by the time they've actually pushed the spacebar, we're 3 trials down the road. They've responded to something entirely different. We missed all sorts of data where it looks like they haven't. Like it just, we couldn't be confident in the sorts of indices that we were getting. So that led Ted and I to start to develop some assessments that we thought could capture the things that we wanted to study. So we did this to enable our own research first and foremost, but we're now up to 8 different iPad-based assessments of executive function, of self-regulation, and other foundational abilities now, including language and early mathematics. We've ensured their psychometric rigor. They're all playful, they're story-like apps, they're cartooned, there's a narrative around them, trying to gamify the apps so that children want to play them, but also brief. They're 5 to 8 minutes, each one of them. We use the affordances of technology in that the instructions are inbuilt. It'll sequence, it'll do start and stop rules, it'll do the scoring in the background without creating advantages from technological familiarity. So the way that you interact and respond to these assessments is the same as you would with paper and pencil, but the technology in the background allows us to do some of these other things that help to standardize the assessment. I'll give just one example. This is our early years toolbox number assessment, so early mathematics. We've evaluated things like its concurrent validity with existing measures. So we compared it to the differential ability scale early number concepts, the preschool early numeracy scale, showing correlations from 0.7 to 0.8, even though ours is an 8-minute assessment. Test retest with a 2-week retest interval, we see a correlation of almost 0.9 between test and retest. One of the things that we do as well, though, because we're interested in if anything that we make or do or find can be helpful, we'd like it to be helpful with as few barriers as possible. So after we sort of attest to all the things that these do and satisfy ourselves that they can do these things, we release them for other people to use without contracts or barriers or big costs or all the other things that often sit around it. But one of the user bases that we're particularly interested in is educators. Can we broaden the user base? Because a lot of the assessments that we would use are the realm of psychologists and speech pathologists and all sorts of other user groups, but not necessarily the educators or parents that are with the child every day. So one of the things we also evaluate is what's the consequence of educators using it? For that evaluation, we give educators a brief induction to the tool, an orientation to it. Here's what it is, here's what it looks like, here's how to do it. Some brief introduction to general good assessment principles, but 10 minutes. And we also have it administered by a highly trained researcher who was involved in building the tools and knows them inside out, as well as assessment inside and out. So we do test, retest, almost the same, except one's done by an educator, one's done by a researcher, and we counterbalance them. So sometimes the educator does it first, sometimes the researcher does it first. What we find when we do that, with the tools that we've evaluated, is a correlation of 0.9 between educator-derived data and researcher-derived data, and no significant difference, no discernible difference between data derived from an educator or from a researcher. So just to say where this early years toolbox work is up to, we've got 8 apps, and we put everything that we do online, validation with benchmarks with more than 5,000 children, free online training and resources. But the interest in the approach, and I think it's the sort of barrier-free access to the tools we see through things like it's been downloaded by more than 20,000 different users across more than 50 countries and 5 continents. In collaboration with partners and at their request, we've translated some of the tools into 16 different languages. In Australia alone, it's being used annually to assess about 30,000 different children to inform planning and practice. On the assessment angle, I also wanted to give a nod to the Global Executive Function Initiative because they're doing some important work around assessment as well. So this was formed by Jelena Obradović from Stanford University in 2023. She secured some funding to bring a number of people together to, in the first instance, talk about executive function assessment and how do we empower a global research base on executive function. And globally relevant theory on executive function. And from those initial meetings, we were actually able to publish a paper that argued that even if executive function skills may be universal in a number of ways, in how it contributes to learning, in how it contributes to goal attainment, our current approaches to assessment may not be. And it takes up the issue of the typical practice of taking an executive function, or you could apply this similarly to self-regulation task that was developed in a Western context, and simply language translating it and transplanting it into a very different context and assuming that it's going to work in the same way. In fact, we identify a number of ways and reasons that this might not be appropriate and could compromise data. Just as some examples, one of the members, Lucia Alcala, does research with Yucatec Maya children, and she talks about how the typical mode in those contexts and cultures is children watch the adults' behaviors and what they're doing. And once children feel like they know what's going on and how to help, then children get involved. That is the prototypical way that the children will get involved. It is entirely unusual for an adult that doesn't really know the child and the child doesn't know the adult to sit down with them and say, here's what we're going to do. And you're going to do it without that observation and without the sort of familiarity with the task. There's all sorts of others as well. Yuko Munakata finds children in America are not so good at a marshmallow task. They tend to not wait the entire wait period, where children in Japan can wait quite easily that entire time. Take that exact same paradigm, a delay of gratification paradigm, but make it a gift. You have to wait to unwrap it. Children in America do perfectly fine. They'll wait the entire time, and children in Japan don't. Right, so there are cultural contextual factors that are influencing our measurements, and if we're not aware of them, it's compromising the evidence that we're generating. But one of the problems and one of the conclusions we draw is the extent to which these things are problematic. So how problematic are they? Where are they problematic? In which ways might we want to adapt those assessments to make them not problematic? Isn't well understood because we have insufficient evidence to be able to study them. So another watch this space. This isn't going to be a definitive word on it, but just to say opportunistically, we have access to a data set that did some executive function assessments as a tertiary sort of outcome. It's a study on physical activity and health first and foremost. But they've got more than 60 countries in this study, and their tasks, all of their measures are simply language translated and implemented. So we now have an opportunity to exploit those data to try and understand for where do these tasks perform differently. Now, I said it that way quite intentionally because in the literature, there's a tendency to take group differences and then make inferences about the groups relative to each other. What we're investigating is where does the task perform differently and why? We expect that items of this difficulty should be able to be done by children at this level of ability, and here's the sort of curves we expect. Where does the task not do that? The problem is in the task, and we can start to identify some of these assumptions and challenge them and do a deeper dive to understand why this task doesn't perform well there and put some evidence behind the principles. More evidence behind the principles. Shonali set me up to talk a little bit about digital, so I would be remiss not to, and I'll end there. One of the other things that I said is my research follows areas in which self-regulation is invoked for issues of public concern or interest or relevance. And one of the big ones for a number of years now is digital activity or digital self-regulation. And it's in response to families' concerns, educators' concerns, policymakers' concerns around children's screen use. And we see these almost every day in the media now in different ways. Social media bans and techno tantrums and tech tantrums are new norm for screen-crazed kids. Here's how to avoid them. All manner. What we find is the picture is probably not surprising, much more nuanced than this. So we ran a meta-analysis of all of the studies that had looked at some aspect of self-regulation, some dimension of it, and some aspect of children's digital activity. So we could understand, is there an association? The one that's commonly bandied about, children can't pay attention anymore, or screens are making our children not be able to pay attention, or there's big behaviors and emotions and tantrums when I refuse or when we need to transition away. We talk about it a lot, but does that association actually exist? And the answer is kind of, and sometimes. So when we look just with indices of time, so self-regulation association with screen time, negative 0.12, like it's not a very robust association, and there's a lot of variability in there. It's actually, it flips positive for gaming. For TV viewing, it's quite small. It gets highest for social media at negative 0.15. Where we do see more robust associations of self-regulation with digital activity is things like problematic digital engagement. So problematic digital engagement measures are normally around, do they do it a lot? Does it interfere with life? Are they not able to do things that they need to do? Is it sort of all-consuming? So whether you look at that globally or by different sorts of devices or activities digitally, we see a much stronger association of self-regulation with those. And also risky digital behaviors, things like online communication with strangers is quite a robust association. But what I was disappointed about in that meta-analysis, we went broad, anything from birth to 16, any dimension of self-regulation, any dimension of digital activity, I want to know what's out there. And almost invariably, a study was either an association with screen time or an association with problematic digital engagement. There was no nuance around how, why, when, for what purposes, for whom self-regulation is involved in children's digital engagement. So that's our job now, I guess. There's a lot of people that are engaged in this sort of research, doing really interesting work. We're joining them to try and bring evidence to these questions. I want to tell you just about a couple, and then I'll stop talking. One of the first, this is led by a colleague, Samudu, who ran an experimental study on the effects of persuasive design in digital products for children, and if and how that interacted with child factors like self-regulation. So what she did is she identified, based on a content analysis, apps that were low in persuasive design. They didn't have many instances or types of persuasive design features. Things like ads and in-app purchases and visual stimulation, the sparkles and the sounds that draw your attention. Character persuasion, where a character that you know and trust tries to get you to do this thing and is sad if you don't do it. All of those sorts of persuasive design conditions. So a low one, a moderate one, and a high one. She tried to match them as well as she could in what they were about. They were all about caring for a pet. And then children were randomly assigned to play with one of these apps. We developed a digital disengagement paradigm to try and understand things around children's behaviors and transitions. So the way that went briefly was children had 6 minutes to play with the app, and then we wanted them to come join us for another activity. At the 5-minute mark, we were sat beside them, but sort of doing our own thing, or at least pretending to do our own thing for a while. The 5-minute mark, we turned a sand timer to say, okay, there's 1 minute left. We didn't expect the children of the age that we're interested in would be able to tell time. So we used a sand timer. Once all the sand is gone, I'd like you to come join me just in that bit of the room over there. And we went and stood there, again, pretending to be busy, but of course, watching them out of the corner of our eye. And we wanted to see, how well do children disengage? How independently do children disengage? And does that vary with the level of persuasive design? Short answer, yes, it does. At moderate or high levels of persuasive design, children took longer to disengage and required more adult intervention to disengage, either verbal reminders or in a number of cases having to go over and gently encourage them to come with us to the next place and physically turn the device off. With high self-regulation, though, children with high self-regulation disengage from even high persuasive design apps just as easily as they did with low persuasive design apps. So self-regulation seemed to matter as a sort of resistant factor to the urging of persuasive design. One of the problems is these are commercially available apps that differ in so many different ways beyond just persuasive design. Yes, they were caring for a pet, but they were so very different too. So we went about creating a tool where we could safely and carefully manipulate different persuasive design conditions. So we wanted it to be something that we could philosophically stand behind. So this is a story maker app. It's something constructive and creative and productive, which we called Giggle Scribbles, where you pick a character, you pick a background, it assembles those together, and then you can color it in, you can embellish it with stickers, and then you can audio record your story over top, and there's voice filters. You can sound like a dragon or a chipmunk or all sorts of different things, and then you can save your story if you wanted to watch it back later. But it allows us to do some safe, persuasive design manipulations to see if they're consequential while keeping all the conditions otherwise consistent, except for that manipulation. Things like locked options, although children aren't actually going to buy anything. Do they even try and go for a locked option? There's a Steamboat Willie limited time offer. If you click now, you can get that character into your, but again, no money exchanges hands. There's ads to artificial products. There's Quincy points at some things and says, pick this character. And we get to see, do they do that? And does it matter if we start to layer these persuasive design conditions? So in the first study with this, we put this in the early start discovery space for 6 weeks on the floor as a limited time sort of thing that children could play with. We didn't ask anyone to play. We didn't try and encourage anyone to play. If they wanted to play, they could play. The first questions were things like, do children actually want to do this thing? Did we do our job right? And then if we did, does persuasive design seem to matter at all in something that didn't quite look like the other apps that we were talking about, because we did something creative and productive and constructive. So 6 weeks with 4 different variants of the app. So children would just randomly pick which iPad they want to go to, and there'd be different persuasive design conditions on each of them. Over those 6 weeks, 565 children elected to play. Their parents let them play, age 3 to 6. On average, they played for about 10 minutes, and most of them reported liking the app or liking it a lot. More than half came back to do more than one story. So in terms of interest and engagement, it seemed like we had done that job. We saw some interesting patterns, and we haven't even published this yet. This is hot off the presses. We saw some interesting patterns in the effects of persuasive design. So under multiple layered persuasive design conditions, if you put everything on, children play for longer. They tend to have a harder time disengaging from the app. But we found at an individual design level, persuasive design isn't always persuasive. At the character page, if Quincy's urging you to pick a character, children don't pick that one with any more frequency. And it seems to be that children already have a strong preference about who the protagonist of their story is going to be. And no amount of Quincy urging is going to deviate them from, I want the unicorn, or I want the dinosaur, or I want the whatever it is I want. But when it came to the background screen, which maybe they're a little bit more indifferent about, Quincy's urging was a lot more compelling. So children did tend to go towards that urging and select those things more when it was background design. I was heartened to see that children tended to avoid the locked options, which suggests to me that we can learn to resist persuasive design. We've done it. Children learn not to touch the locked option, although not all children. Some of the children attempted the parental control up to 9 times. We have a parallel study going in preschools right now where we're also capturing self-regulation. We couldn't do that on the discovery space floor because it was just come and play if you want to play. But we'll start to look at if and how these things might interact with things like self-regulation as well. Now that's a lot of talking from me, so I'm going to end there, and I thank you kindly for your attention and for coming to